Thank you for that delightful reception. And welcome, everyone. Super excited to have an amazing panel here today. And we're going to talk to you about dreams. And dreams are complicated. But the dream that we're going to try to articulate for you today is what the world looks like if we can dream about a world where families have the resources that they need to thrive. And that's going to be built on a society where we actually value families and honor them and their love for their kids. So we're going to hear a lot of examples about spotting readiness for those dreams to be actualized, developing partnerships out in the real world to try to get them moving, and working on actualizing those dreams even when times are difficult. As themes that I think that we're going to be touching on, I want you to look for a few that I'll try to pull threads on as we go, which include questions about expertise. Who counts as an expert and why? Whose voices and insights do we implicitly trust or distrust? How do issues of race and ethnicity and class affect all of the choices that we're making, and where power flows? And how do we think about reaccumulating and redirecting some of that power? And importantly, thinking about what our relationship is with affected communities. So what I'd like to do is start with you, Christine, and I'd like you to talk to us about readiness. So if we're going to dream about a better world and then go fight for it, we need to look for fields that are ripe for planting. And so if you're thinking about readiness, how do you go about looking for signs that we as a society are ready for change? Maybe that our workforce and our institutions can bear some of that change? And importantly, how do we think about maybe inducing change if we're not seeing enough readiness for it?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. I'm really happy to be here this afternoon. So this is about dreaming big, and the dream that I have is that all children get to grow up in their families. And so that really is the work that we've been focused on at the Department of Children and Families in New Jersey, and really what I feel like my job is every day, and the goal that I have for my Ascend work and then in my everyday work is that we eliminate the need for non-kin foster care, because that's the only way, at least through our systems, we're going to be able to keep families whole and allow children to grow up with their families. And when we talk about readiness or societal readiness, I think there are a lot of signs that society is ready for a change in child welfare and for us to stop removing children from their families. And unfortunately, this country has a significant history of separating families, from slavery to the Indian boarding schools to even recently at the southern border, separating children from their families. But we do it every day in this country in the name of child safety through foster care. And no one really has been screaming about that, and it needs to change. And so when I became the commissioner in 2018, really there's a lot of transformational work happening in the department, but this kinship was really one that I had set forth as a goal for our entire team. And so it is one of our 4 transformational goals, and we've been working on it since 2018. During that time, I started with a listening tour, and in that first year, talked to over 500 parents and children around the state, and then have continued to do that. But it was those initial conversations, and then talking with our staff about their readiness and the need to change at the organization level to be able to place children with relatives. And we have reduced the number of placements just across the board. New Jersey has the lowest rate of placement of children entering foster care to begin with. And now, on top of that, we have a very high rate of children being placed with relatives. And so in that, looking at organizational readiness, the first thing we did was started with a staff attitude survey, because it's one thing to say, this is the goal and now we're all going to move in this direction, but it's another thing to actually get your workforce to start making changes in how the decisions they make. And so we started with this staff attitudes toward kin survey. And from that information, we then put together in all of department goals around kinship. So at first, I had my IT department and HR saying, this has nothing to do with us. When in reality, they're the ones who are developing tools or changing systems to make it easier for the workers to then, make decisions around kin. And so it is an across-the-board goal for the department. And then we used every lever available to us. We changed legislation so that now kin is the priority for placement. So that means the judges are always asking that question. We changed policy internally. We changed practice. We actually changed the structure of units within each of our local offices. And now, as an example, you have to get an exception request to place with traditional foster care versus the exception request to place with kin, which is how we started. So and so it was really important that we remove the barriers for staff and make it easier. We did implicit bias training. There were a number of different things that we did, but it was all with that goal of not only providing the tools and the education and saying we have this big dream, but now how do we actually put that into action? And I'll end with, we did a follow-up survey just in February of 2023, another staff attitude toward kin. And in those, from 2019 to 2023, we saw a significant increase in staff attitudes towards kin in almost every area of the survey. It increased. Staff were less risk averse. Staff felt that they were supported to make the decisions. They had the tools available to them. And in 2021, in January of 2021, it was the first time in our system's history that we had more children placed with kin than in traditional foster care. And that's, continuing. So I think society is ready, families are ready, and now systems need to catch up.
Indeed. Super important questions remain there, including how do we get upstream so that the kinship placements, which are admirably expanding in New Jersey, are even less necessary, right? Yeah,
I have answers to that too. That's another panel.
Indeed. And an important thing here, I think, for us all to recognize is that it was important for you to act and think about systems being responsive to the needs of community, even when your staff didn't display a readiness. And by taking those actions and showing them the kind of results it could produce, that's what got them ready. And that's what started to change some of the narratives and attitudes.
Yeah.
So in thinking about how we get stuff done in the world, it's important to think about systems and what bigger system is there than the federal government. So it's important to think about how do we spot readiness, but once we spot it, we got to do something with it. We have to develop partnerships. We have to go out into the world and take action. So Aysha, I'd really like to hear from you some of the things that you all have been working on within the federal government, particularly in response to the hard work that you've been doing to listen to our affected communities about what they want and need, to make some of these dreams start moving into action.
Thanks, Anthony. I think one of the things that I'm most proud of working for the Biden-Harris administration is that we do not make a move unless we've spoken to and been in conversation with impacted individuals, right, and families. And so that was a tone that was set certainly from the time that I was appointed in March 1st of 21. And so we have always been very intentional about how we listen first. So, right, listen, invest, and then how can we support, right? And sometimes doing all of those things at the same time. So, it's so funny, Christine, that you brought up surveys because, during this administration, we, for the first time, actually, across the nation, Black and Native children are disproportionately impacted by foster care. They're disproportionately brought into foster care throughout the nation. And so there's been an emphasis on listening to impacted families from Indigenous families and Black families as well. And during this administration, I guess last summer this time, we, for the first time, held some national roundtables around the Black experience of families that are impacted not only by child welfare, but ACF programs in general. And this was the first time that that had been done. And we just invited, what we wanted was the sort of uncurated voices. Because a lot of times we have advocacy groups and they're very well, they're very well prepared to come to DC, to have these conversations. You can tell they've been trained, they know exactly what it is to say, what not to say. And sometimes we don't want that. We want you to keep it real. So we were looking for the uncurated voices. We went out and we used community-based organizations to help us to find people that would come and talk to us. The Divine Nine, for example, churches and communities. We really wanted to get to people who wouldn't normally have access to the federal government and to tell us what they need or what more they needed from us. And so, that's an example of how we have listened. We have also been doing tribal convenings. I was late yesterday. I arrived late yesterday afternoon because we had a tribal convening in Region 8 to hear from tribal leadership. Most of you know that the Supreme Court recently ruled in favor of the Indian Child Welfare Act, but this had been something that for the past year was making so many of us very, very nervous. I'm proud to say that, Aspen Ascend was very supportive of, what can we do to get the word out about how important it is to support the Indian Child Welfare Act. Well, now we sort of won that battle where the Supreme Court is concerned, but now it's like, okay, the issues remain, and so we want to make sure that we keep the pressure on and keep the energy on in terms of making sure that Indian children can remain with their families and in their communities. So consistently having those conversations. So listening has really been important under this administration, but also investing. Like, what are we doing? How can the federal government help? A lot of times people come to us really, for support, for financial support and funding. And one of the things that I'm also very proud about is that, we, and I talked about this earlier in a workshop, I was in a meeting with some parents probably early last year sometime, and one of the parents said to me, you need to put the money in the community. She said, every time there's the federal government puts out what we call NOFOs, Notice of Funding Opportunities, it's always, we're going to give you money to do this, that, and then do a little bit of this. But she was like, put the money in the community. Let us decide in our communities what it is we need. And her voice never left my head. I can still hear her say, and I still meet with that parent group regularly. So when the opportunity came around what we were going to do in Children's Bureau with our discretionary funds, I asked about a particular sort of vehicle to do a discretionary NOFO called a field-initiated approach. And it's a vehicle that apparently no one has used in a really long time. I asked my deputy, who has been there for 30 years, whether or not this had happened. He said, not since I've been here. So I don't know if it's ever been done before, but certainly not in a long time. And what it is that we put the money out there and we say to the communities, you tell us how you would use it. You tell us what partnerships you would want to form. You tell us what problem you would want to solve. And in this case, it's a field-initiated NOFO for approaching racial bias in the child welfare system. So really doing things differently, right? Disrupting and doing things differently. And I will tell you, I was advised, actually, when I started to ask about that approach, someone said, why would you do that? Just tell them exactly how they should use the money, right? Mm. But I opted out of that approach. And so actually the deadline for that NOFO was yesterday. So I'm really excited to see what communities say that they need and how they plan to solve those problems. But then also, right, so listen, invest, and then support. And we want to make sure that at the federal government, Children's Bureau, but also my sister agencies, my partners, that we are being as supportive as we can. Are we sitting here in the ivory tower like we're the federal government, all we do is grants here and there, or are we really digging in and leaning in and supporting communities? And so we have to be intentional as well about the support that we provide, not just the support that we think we should be providing, right? But the support that communities, states, local governments tell us that that is needed. So.
Super critical. A couple important threads to pull on here. So we've got to act on what the community tells us that they want and need, but we won't know unless we ask, unless we go out and listen and actively invite people to tell us what they want and need. And importantly, I think one thing that I will try to lift up here is that we can't merely rest our laurels on all of the highly polished voices. So I'm an alumnus of the foster care system, but I also have 3 degrees and went to fancy schools. And if you're only talking to me and not to a 14-year-old that's living in a group home or a foster home or a kinship placement today, right now, you're not going to get the right answers. And I think it's a really critically important thing to think about is how we're activating those current voices that are close to the problems right now if we want to get those correct answers. So thank you for that work and figuring out how to put resources into the hands of people who already know how to use them because they're close to the problems. Right. So, okay, we've thought a little bit about how to look for readiness. Where is there readiness for change? Where are those opportunities? We've thought a little bit about how to implement them. And importantly, how to listen to community in implementing what needs to change. And so, Ebony, I'd like to invite you in to thinking about how we can take those moments where the readiness exists. Maybe there's resources, maybe there isn't, but there's a will to fight for a dream that's rooted in the things that we know we need as members of impacted communities. So talk to us about your journey in activating and executing on a dream.
Okay, so I come to this space in 2 ways. The first way is through being a social entrepreneur. And as a social entrepreneur, my pursuit was to ensure the holistic well-being of children of incarcerated parents, children and young adults with incarcerated parents. And then I also come from the vantage point of lived experience. And that was, my father was incarcerated for 33 years of my life. And for most of that, there was no hope. It was like no hope. Life without parole, he was never coming home. And when I was able to understand that, oh my God, it really just really put me in a shell. And so I'll give you some statistics so that you all understand how mass incarceration has surged, the separation of children and families, and the health and well-being of children with incarcerated parents. There are currently almost 5 million children under the age of 18 that have a parent that's incarcerated. And there are over 10 million children who at some point in their life have been impacted by parental incarceration. And so with that understanding as a social entrepreneur and looking at that context, and then having the lived experience, I took a step back and said, wait, how are these systems supporting our families? And what I came to find is that most people look at the issue from the perspective of children under the age of 18, as if there is some magic button at the age of 18, and all of a sudden all the pain and trauma and stigma and shame that come from having a parent that's incarcerated dissipates. And so I said, no, we have to change the narrative. And so I founded We Got Us Now, literally. We got us now, because that's what we had to do. We had to take accountability for ourselves so that others could understand how to best support us. There have been many narratives about, false myths about who children of incarcerated parents were, and that they were doomed for incarceration, which is absolutely not true. I'm one of 4 siblings. None of us have been incarcerated. Our father was incarcerated for 3 decades. Our father remained a consistent father throughout that entire experience. And so that made me say, wait a minute. If the federal government is saying, and the administration at the time is saying that this is an issue, mass incarceration, then I may need to actually say something to help my dad, who had been fighting, who had never stopped being a dad, and his love had never stopped. So I said, I may need to step up and say something. And so I did. And in the process, I discovered so many daughters and sons that were just like me, that were part of this historically invisible population, navigating these systems with no support. And so I decided to build a community for us. And in that community, what we decided to do is look at all of what was happening. Most of the information or most of the research that was being done was deficit-based. And so we decided that, wait a minute, we're gonna look at this issue from a positive perspective. Let's look at this issue and figure out how could we best support these systems and sectors as partners, not just participants. Because as participants, people would ask us to come to the table and we would feel tokenized, oftentimes re-traumatized, oftentimes just stigmatized by these false narratives that are continually perpetuated through false data or inaccurate data. And so we wanted to be able to say, you know what, we know what's wrong. And this love is transactional that has happened between us and our parents. Why do I have to, if my father's in a federal prison, I have to travel several states to visit him. I traveled across 8 different states just to visit him. I'm sorry, in 8 different facilities across the United States. That's a different experience than having a parent that's in jail, which is a county jail. That's different than having a parent that is in a state prison. But mind you, there's some big states. California is huge. And so we need to think about, like, what are these simple things that we need to change? And so We Got Us Now has been instrumental in passing 5 pieces of legislation. 2 at the state level, 2 at the federal level, and 1 at the local level. And those are all centered around family integrity, family well-being, and looking at this issue from the perspective of the children, looking through the lens of the children. Stop looking at this issue from the perspective of the parent and what they did wrong. And it's bad enough that they're separated from us. But now, even still in 2023, now we have predatory systems through technology that are totally erasing our in-person contact. And so now, virtual visits have come into play as a means to keep our families connected. And how can we keep our families connected if we can't even, a kid can never understand what it means to be connected to their parent. A 5-year-old would never understand what it would mean to be connected to their parent through a screen. That's not gonna soothe the hurt and pain. That's not gonna soothe the hug that he may need from his mother who has been away for the last 5 years. That's not gonna soothe that. We gotta look at this from a human perspective. And so that's what We Got Us Now has been able to do, has been able to really bring to these different systems and sectors the education and knowledge that we as subject matter experts understand from our lived experience, but also from our professional expertise. Mm-hmm. And so we have a national network of daughters and sons who are now doing that work.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Your hair.
Oh, sorry.
An amazing lesson in all of that is something that we all need to remember, which is that families love their kids, kids love their parents, and we, as a society, owe it to each other to make sure that they can express that love and feel it. Families need the resources and the opportunities to express their love, because you didn't stop loving your dad when he was inside, and he didn't stop loving you. And we need to do more and better by families, even under those circumstances, to make sure that families can be intact and can experience that love. So we've got a very brief amount of time left on this stage, but I want to challenge my panelists to challenge you with the most extraordinary dreams that they can summon for the future, dreams that might feel so dreamy that they don't even dare to dream them and say them out loud. So I'm going to go from my right to my left and ask you all briefly, maybe in 30 seconds, to articulate a dream that you have for a world that values families and the love that they have for their kids. What do you almost not dare to dream?
A world that prioritizes all of the resources that it can bear, particularly in this country, and there are plenty, and ensures that every family has what it needs, and clears the way for the path for every family to have everything that it needs, includes mental health, substance abuse, that we live by a love ethic, that we set fear aside, those of us who are in positions to do so, that we check our privilege, that we cede our power where we have to, and so that families can have what they need and children can continue to be loved in all aspects of their life.
Absolutely. Christine?
And building on what Aysha said, that we lead with love, that everything that we do, that all of the decisions we make, that we keep children and families at the center of that. And I think we do that through love. You know, I started out by saying my dream was to eliminate the need for foster care or non-kin foster care. I would step it up to say if I had any dream, it would be to end child poverty, because I think that would be the way to get to much of what Aysha is dreaming, what Ebony is asking for, and really there would be no need for a child welfare system.
I would say that my dream is to ensure that there's checks and balances, because I don't believe that the prison system is going to end. And so I would dream that organizations like We Got Us Now are being able to be sustained generationally, right? So what we've been able to do, what happens when I leave the work? I want this organization to be able to be sustained for the next 50 years. I mean, thinking about it from the perspective of 50 years of mass incarceration, that's 50 years of policies that we've had to undo. We deserve 50 years of support and resources and capital. So that would be my big dream.
I think that's a great way to end it. So let's give a hand to the panel, and thank you for your time.